Okay. So I just put up the program for today. And I will give a lecture on Rook Endgames and why I believe they are so difficult to master. Before we get there, let me say that I think we should use the chat function. It's very convenient. I will have this masterclass and I will ask some questions on the way. And then you can answer me in the chat. So you can all give your reply. You can only write to me, so you're not giving anything away to the others. Also, if you have any questions at all, you can just post them in the chat. It's much easier like that. Okay, so before we get to the content of the chess, allow me to just spend a couple of minutes of presenting myself. So I'm a Danish IM. Yeah, hi. So I'm a Danish IM who moved to the US at the beginning of 2017. I live here with my wife and we both have a green card, so we immigrated. I've written 7 books, 4 of them. The last 4 has been for quality chess. So you can see a list of the books here. And in 2018, I founded Silo Game Products with my wife. So the Lu part of Silo Games is my wife's name. So that's why it's Silo Games. So I also blog at silasespenlund.com. And I have a special offer for my 4 books here during the festival. If you purchase during the festival, you'll get a discount of 25%. And if you purchase more than $75 US from my blog, we will do free deliver also in Canada. And before we get to the online programs, let me just show this is my blog. And if you go to the shop, you can see this is my signed books, like here. So there's a list of them. And we also do chess calendar with 1 chess position every day and solution the next day. The one for 2021 will be out very soon, and it will be a rip-off calendar. There will also be an ebook included in the price. So you tear off the pages, but you don't lose the content because you'll get an ebook too. And on my blog, I also have there's a lot of exercises, there's a lot about my books. So there's a lot of stuff there. Oh, sorry, I didn't share my screen, I think. Anyway, let's go back. No. Excuse me, too many documents open here. Let's see. Yeah, I also want to mention my online chess programs. So this is very much what I do here. I would do a presentation of about an hour, and then it would be 2 hours in total because there would be some puzzle session. Today we are only going to do the masterclass. So that will be a long presentation like that. So you can see that here. And I also do one-on-one classes, and you can find me on social media. This one is for the WeChat. You're also welcome to send me an email on silas.lund@gmail.com. Okay. Yeah, let's get to the chess part. So Rook Endgames, they are really challenging. And let's see. Excuse me. Let me make this brief introduction. That's what I wanted to do before we start out. So we have Rook Endgames, and we start out with the key position. That was the one you just saw, but I'm going to tell you about that. That is usually the position that ends up when we have pawn races. When rook versus pawn, it will often end up in this key position, so we will have a look at that. But the main reason why intermediate moves are so challenging is these intermediate moves. So they are there all the time in Rook Endgames, in the calculations on the board, and they are so easy to miss. So actually, if you look in older books before the era of the computer, you'll find a lot of mistakes, and most of those mistakes are due to the intermediate moves. They are constantly there. So for instance, I like to consult Averbach's work, and most of the mistakes I find in his books in the Rook Endgames are all intermediate moves, most of them. Then I have something I call the magic trick. And there are also waiting moves in Rook Endgames, even though they are very sharp, there's still waiting moves. So that makes it extra tricky. And then if we have time, we can talk a little bit about some basic theory, and even that is hard in Rook Endgames. So you had the endgame theory that is not easy, and then you add all the tricks on top of that. So Rook Endgames, they are really hard to master. I will use some material from my book Sharp Endgames, but there's also a lot of new material. So now let's go to the chess part. And as I said, you're welcome to ask questions on the way. I will ask a few questions myself. So this is white to move, and the promotion square is up here on H8. So it's white to move and draw. So do you, by any chance, know what is the first move here to draw the game? Yeah, so this position is actually more complicated than it seems. And this is what I call the key position. So the kings are lined up like this, and the pawn is here, all on the 6th rank or the 3rd rank, depending on how you see it. And then it all depends on who's to move. Do you record this for Facebook? Yeah, I think Ken does all that. I'm just doing a lecture, but I think he's live now and he does that. But I'm not sure about those details. So H7 actually loses because now black can force the white king to the edge of the board. And now we have this move king F7, with the idea that if white promotes to a queen, we can check and pick up the queen. And the last resort is now to promote to a knight. But promoting to a knight in the corner rarely works, and it doesn't work in this case either, because it cannot get out. So now all we need to do is make a waiting move, and white is lost. He will either get mated or lose the knight. So taking that knight, promoting to a knight in the corner, almost never works. So white lost this position because the black king was allowed to get closer. So that is the main priority here. White is trying to kick the black king out, and black will try to get the king closer. So the only move to save the game here is king to G7. And when I give this check to try to get my king in, where should the white king go now? Yeah, to all those new who just arrived, we mainly use the chat function. You're welcome to give your suggestion. You all can also answer me anything. And I will see everything you put in the chat. Yeah, Jaden, you're correct. It has to be king F8. And it's the same logic as before. We have to keep the black king out. That's the most important. If we try to stalemate ourselves in the corner, well, it's a pretty good idea. But black can break the stalemate like this. And now we have two ways of winning. We have a fancy one and a boring one. The boring one is just to play king here and go for the pawn. And now we just pick up the pawn and win later. The fancy one is to allow white to promote to a knight, to try to save himself. And we've already seen this. What's the winning move here? We just need to put white in a Zugzwang. Yeah, Rook G1. And white is in Zugzwang. Whatever he does, he will lose the knight or get checkmated. So the thing with these positions is it's actually only in the corner that the knight. If we moved everything down one, let's say the knight was here and the king was there, this would be a draw. So it really is only in the corner that's bad for white. So we had two ways of winning there. So white needs to keep the black king out. That's why king f8. And now if we play here, white simply goes back. So I have one last trick up my sleeve. I can give a check here. And now I can give a check on f7. And what do you think? Do you think white should go king g8 or king g6? Only one of those moves will draw the game. Yeah, king g6 is correct. And here comes the question. After king g6, black probably has to go back. And now we are at the beginning, where again we can play like this to draw the game. The big question is, of course, why is king g8 losing? And I have seen even IMs can go wrong here. And that simply shows you how difficult it is to spot these intermediate checks. So they are there all the time, but mostly in the calculations. It's so easy to miss. So let's see why. King f6, h7. And now let's say I would like to go out here, so I could give a check, maybe checkmate. But that doesn't work because you can just promote with a check. So what I do is, before I go to a7, I just disturb you a little bit by going rook g7. That is the intermediate move. That is easy to miss and can be so powerful. So if white goes this way, we take the pawn. And if he goes in the corner, we have a checkmate in 2 moves. So when people go wrong in this position and play king g8, it's because they miss this intermediate check. So we will see a lot of these intermediate check, and I believe this is the main reason why Rook Endgames are so hard. Okay, so that key position is very important. So let's see, the key position would be this one, since a1 is the promotion square of the black pawn there. So, and every time the white king is trying to approach from the side, like this, it will often end up in this key position. So let's see. Black to move first. So now we have on a totally open board, and we have some kind of race where the white king is trying to get back in time to stop the pawn. So the question is, how can we orientate ourselves on such a completely open board? And the key position is one thing, one orientation point. So let's see. Well, the pawn is going down here. This is the promotion square. So king b7 doesn't make so much sense. So let's say we have a couple of options. You probably know that a5 is bad because this cutoff on the 5th rank is just winning. Black can do nothing. Once the pawn gets to a3, we can attack it from the side and then from behind to eliminate it. So that doesn't work. So a5 is ruled out, so we have to make a king move. So what is the difference between playing king b5 and playing king c5? Which one would you choose? Yeah, so we have to choose. King c5 is correct. And the idea is we have to do both attack and defense in one move. And the most important thing is to try to keep the white king out. So we try to body check it or shoulder it. So let's see, king c5 is the correct move. Let's see what happens if black plays king b5. Then we can get into a race like this. Let's see. No, let's see here. And now we have the key position with white to move. And white is winning quite simple by now the king comes in. So actually this is a mate in 3 moves. I mean, white is winning, but we do have a mate in 3 move like this. Okay. But somehow we got to the key position with white to move. So black has to avoid that. Yeah, it's a nice mate. So let's see, king c5. We're going to look at the magic trick later, but the magic trick would be like, or part of it would be to, if we could move the rook here and then force the king back. But this is a study, and there's a reason why he put the rook on the worst square on the board. So now white has to play king f7. And now let's try to follow. So that white king is aiming for d3. So far it's going well for white. He's not losing any time. Okay, we play a3. He goes king e4. And now we go king c4. So this is the moment where white has to lose a tempo. And it's all because we went this way to b3. Moving forward and shouldering the white king. So it's quite an important tempo. So white has nothing better than to give a check or to attack the pawn. But it all ends up in the key position with black to move. So, and here again, we have the move king b2. And if a check, we play king c1 to keep the white king out. And if white tries this last trick, we have to go up here to keep the white king out. And if white goes back to the starting position, again, king b2. So you should know these details about the key position. It is quite important, and we will see it later too. So let's move on. So this is the end of a famous study by Kasparian. And white is winning. So if you haven't seen this before, this is very nice. White is a whole queen up, but it's not so easy. So black is threatening b2 check and rook c2 check. Both of them are checkmate at the moment. So there's no point in, let's say, giving a check on that long diagonal, because then this is a draw. So it's not so easy for white. So the solution is to play queen a3. Well, my main point of showing this is not to show a beautiful study, although it is a very beautiful ending to the study. Rook to d2 now, with the idea that now we can play rook b2. And black is in Zugzwang, has to go rook a2, and then we can play rook b1 checkmate. So it's a very nice idea of queen a3 and then rook d2. So let's see one other line where instead black plays b2 check. And now there's no point in taking with the rook, because we can take the queen, and now we don't have a checkmate, only a perpetual. So white has to take with the queen. a3. So how does white win this position? So let's see, black is about to stalemate himself, and to unstalemate the black king, we need to get to this square. But it seems like we are a little bit too slow. So how do we do this? Yeah, Jaden, that is correct. As I said, if we simply go back here, there's no way to unstalemate the black king. So we give this intermediate check first, and then we go back. Because now that gave us an extra move. And now we are winning. And this is where we had the boring solution and the fancy one, where we allow black to promote to a knight. Okay. Yeah, let's move on. Okay, so this is an endgame where black has just played g5 to try to eliminate the last pawn. That would be a draw if that happened. And by the way, before black played g5, it was a drawn endgame, but g5 immediately was not the way to draw it. And you can see this example for yourself, but my guess is that black missed intermediate check out somewhere in the future. So these are two grandmasters playing, so they are definitely strong players. So let's see, rook f5 check and king e5. Now the knight is doomed. If it moves, then rook takes g5, white is winning. So black's only chance is to give up the knight and go into rook versus pawn, a sharp endgame like that. And black probably saw this. And now black's idea is that he can keep the king out, and this first pawn will divert the white rook, and then black can just walk up the g file. So that was the drawing idea. So king e5 first instead of rook f1 makes the most sense. So we're trying to hold the black king back. Let's see. Now rook comes back. And we have to eliminate that pawn in time. See, black doesn't have time for this king g3 yet because he has to catch up with the pawn. So now h4. And in this critical position, white is actually winning. But I think it's very likely that black thought this was a draw because there's no obvious way for white to try to get into the position. The rook is badly placed and has to spend time getting out there. So it seems like black is on a good way to drawing, but so let's say we would like to get out here with the rook. But before that, we just disturb black a little bit. So rook g2 is the key intermediate move. Let's say if king h3, then black is definitely not in time to stalemate himself. Yeah, white can pick up the pawn like this. So that clearly doesn't work. So has to play king f3. And now we can go to a2. Because now we have found a way in for our king. So let's see. King f5. King has to go to g3. King g2. King g4. And what do we play here? Yes, king to g3 and threatening mate. So the only thing black can do is promote to a knight. And we've been here before. White is winning. checkmate or picking up the knight. So, okay, so it really was all about this little intermediate check, Rook G2. So we can understand why black maybe missed this. And so it's a very easy mistake to make, to miss that move. Let's take the next example. Okay, so how do we stop this pawn? Promotion square is E1. And it seems like the black king is keeping the white king out and can support the pawn. Also, the white rook is in a very clumsy place, so we can't even try to get back behind the pawn. So it's a little bit clumsy here. So what do we do here? So now we will also try to, so we can still use the key position as our guideline. So it's not an edge pawn now, but we can still use this as a point of reference, the king b3, d3, and then the pawn on e3. That's still a good point of reference in these kinds of open positions. So let's say if rook goes to b1, then white is not really in time. We can try to see that. In this position, we need it to be white to move, because then white can play rook d1. But here it's simply a draw. We could also play king d2 here. So we need to somehow improve on rook b1, and we do that by playing rook b4 check. Again, intermediate check on the way to b1. And where is black supposed to go? If he goes forward, then we can just bring our king in and we stop the pawn. So the king has to go backward, trying to keep the white king out. And now we have rook b1. And we have the position with white to move here, and rook d1, king c2. Here white is winning quite easily. Let's say something like this. Now we can just pin the pawn. And if black plays king d2, then we can play king c4 and give a check and play king d3. This is also winning, stopping the pawn on e2. So this intermediate check on b4 was vital, because you cannot, the king was too perfect here. It was still close to the promotion square, and it was also keeping the white king out. So by giving that check, we're forcing the black king to a less optimal square. And that gives us the vital tempo in order to win the game. Okay. So now we're getting into positions with one pawn each, and with a lot of tricks. And we have there are basically two ideas in this position. We could sacrifice our rook on the pawn and then hope that, let's say, king and pawn is able to draw against king and rook. That's one idea. Another idea is to go defensive. Let's say we somehow give up this pawn and then we run to this pawn and we can make a draw like this, because rook and pawn versus rook is not winning. So there is the dynamic counterplay option. There's also the defensive options. So let's see. First, we stop the pawn like this. And now white has a little trick that is good to remember, which is rook a8. So the idea is to threaten promotion, and if the rook takes the pawn, we have this check that picks up the rook. And then if black now tries to run to the pawn, let's say, we can clearly see that black is too slow. He didn't even arrive at the key position, and it's also white to move. So two moves too slow. So that doesn't work. So rook a8 is quite a clever move. And let's see, a2 here doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? How does white win here? So there's a lot of these small tricks in Rook Endgames. Yes, Jaden. Rook takes a2. See, we still have the trick. If rook takes, then rook a7. The problem for black is black doesn't even have time to bring the king into the defense because we're attacking the rook. So black it doesn't give black any time because the rook is hanging on h2 after rook takes a2. So black is basically doomed. Let's say if he just stays on the h file, we have time now to, no, we can do the same trick with rook a8 back again. Threatening promotion, and here we have rook a7. So what can black do about this? It looks like after rook a8, black is doomed here. But there is a way to save the game. So any ideas? So as we saw from this example before, or previous example, this king is kind of perfect here because we saw how it could easily slip maybe to f5 to support the pawn. But if necessary, it could also go the other way to stop the pawn in case we win the rook. So the white king is kind of perfect on e4 to go both ways. So let's say on the way to taking this pawn, we can disturb white a little bit by giving an intermediate check. And this is quite annoying for white. So let's say the white king goes to f5. Now we can take on h7. And now we can run for the pawn. Guess what? If white tries to run back, what should black play here? We're trying to get to the key position. And if we are black, we want the key position with black to move, otherwise it's losing. Yeah, so we are on the way to b3, but we have to go king c4, shouldering the white king, or body checking it. So in this position, white is bound to lose a tempo now. Let's say either check or going behind the pawn. And then now we have the key position with black to move. And we've already seen king b2 is the only way to draw it. So, okay, so here was an annoying intermediate check. What if the king goes the other way? Well, then we can annoy white by, let's see, is that the move? Yeah, we can divert the white rook like this. Because if the rook takes the pawn, we are in time to get closer to the white pawn there on h7. And of course, this pawn is so disturbing because it's only one move away from promotion. So a move like this doesn't make sense. Black simply takes the queen. So the key move here is really rook h4. Just to get the king unbalanced because it was perfect on e4. Both d3 and f5 is suboptimal for different reasons. So rook h4. It's such an easy move to miss. Yeah. Let's try another example. So now we come to the magic trick. So it's a method that's widely used in these endgames. D1 is the promotion square of the black pawn running down the board. And it becomes a race because white needs to bring the king in. So let's see, if I just try to bring the king in like this, I'm going to be too slow with white. Move the rook and then d2, and black is drawing the game. So that is too slow. So what I can do is, what I call the magic trick is, we can take this rook and transfer it to d1 without losing any time. And we can do that because the black king is in front of the pawn. And we disturb the black king with a check. And no matter where the king moves, let's say it moves forward to f3, we can go to d1, and then we're basically forcing the king back. So we have moved our rook magically for free to d1 here. And that makes the whole difference, because now we can attack that d5 pawn. So the trick works because the king is in front of the pawn. If the king, let's say, was here and we started checking, black would also win the tempo moving forward with the king. So that's also why we need to make the magic trick now. This is the mistake, because now black can, well, also win a tempo in. So that the magic trick doesn't work here. So let's see how it goes. Check, king d3. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter if the king goes here and here, because the white king, although it's on the left side of the board, we have the flexibility to go both ways. So that's not really an issue. So let's just see this, king c4. Now we can go on the other side. See, if black could somehow play the move king c2 and attack the rook, then that would be a draw. But there's no time for that, because now white is attacking that pawn, and now white is winning. So that was the extra tempo needed to win the game. Let's see. Yeah, so for those of you who just arrived, we use the chat where you can answer my questions, and where you can also ask me any questions about the position. Let me just unshare for a moment. Oh yeah, we're getting to some examples now. Let's see. Okay. So some of you probably recognize this position. If we go a couple of years back, World Championship match. It's black to move, and the position is drawn, but Carlsen, he ended up winning with white. So let's see. So what black should do would be to check on a2. And if the king tries to run out, try to hide from all the checks, let's say king a3. Now we can take on e4 with this idea that we want to enter f3 at the right time, and then due to the mating threat, we can just keep checking, and there's no escape for the white king. But if we play the king f3 too early, too soon, then the white rook can get out and check us away. So we first play rook a1. And the king is still able to both go to f3, but maybe also take this pawn on f5. So rook a1 first. And let's say after king f3, threatening checkmate. Black makes a draw by perpetual check here. Just checking and going back to a1. So that's what Caruana should have played in the game. So rook a1 in this position. Let's say check first and then, but he took on e4 first. And now he's planning rook a2, followed by king f3. And we get into the line from before. And so even a challenger can miss the idea of the intermediate move. So how does white win now? So it's not like the intermediate move is not some kind of superhuman move. It is often referred to as a computer move, but I say that it's just why Rook Endgames are so hard, because of course computers will see it, but for humans, I think if we just get used to that idea of the intermediate move and we start looking for them, we will also spot them. So so this is definitely something that can be trained. So obviously we want to take this pawn. But before we do that, we're just going to give a little check on e7, just to disturb black. And now we take the pawn. And now this pawn is also lost. And in this 2 versus 1, white is winning. So this is a winning endgame. And Carlsen did indeed win this game by slowly moving the pieces forward. Yeah, in the end, he got these 2 pawns, so that was winning. But it was all down to this rook e7 before we take the pawn on g7. Yeah, an intermediate move there. Let's move forward. So this is white to move and win. e1 is the promotion square of the black pawn. And somehow this king is perfectly placed, right? It's controlling the promotion square. It's supporting the pawn all the way down. And if white wants to win, white definitely has to bring the king in somehow. So the question is, how do we do this? And we also need to somehow bring the rook back and then try to get behind the pawn. So the key is again that the king here is perfect. If it was forced to go to d3 or d1, then the white king will have a way in. So we need to disturb the black king. It's simply too perfect there. So the idea is to move the king so that we have this check on a2 before we go to a8. So how do we do that? Do you think we should go to b1 or b3? What do you think? So while you think about that, I will be back in just one. Sorry about that, a bit of an emergency. So Justin, that is absolutely right. And Anatea too. We have to go to b1. So that's quite an important difference between B3 and B1. So there's a general rule that if we can go along the first rank, we should always choose that. So let's see the difference. Okay, E3, then we have this intermediate check. And now if the king goes up here, we can go to C1. And we have this check here, and we will get to D2. Okay, winning. So the intermediate check on A2, king has to go to D1 because of king C1. And now we go back and give a check. And the kings are now opposed, so black king has to go in there. And how do we win here? Yeah, we use the magic trick, right? So we wanna transfer the rook from here to here. So we just give a check. King has to move away somewhere. Then we give a check. And now we can bring the king closer and control the promotion square. So white is winning. So let's try to see why king b3 doesn't work. The problem is that now we get to the key position. It's the key position type where it is black to move. So let's see. Okay, we still have the check here. And king goes back to d3. And rook a8. So what do we play here with black? So now we are not on the edge of the board. So black actually has two solutions here. But let's just use the same method as we did with key position with a rook's pawn. So king d2, yeah. And if I give a check, where do we go then? Yeah, then we go to c1, exactly. And then white's problem is, again, there's no back rank threats because we promote with a check. And then if white tries to be clever here, we can always just go back into the key position type. So I should say that this is a very good general idea for drawing the games. We simply keep the king out. But in this position, we can also draw by playing e2 because there is space on the other side of that pawn. So that's also a way of drawing the game. Okay, so the king should aim for b1 and then the first rank. Getting that way in front of the pawn is usually the way to win these positions. Let's take another example. So white to move and win, the black pawn is moving down the board. So g1 is our promotion square. And here we want to use the magic trick for several reasons. We want to force the king back here. And also, yeah, get our rook to a better spot. So if we just move the king in here, that is not going to do it. And we can see if white tries something like this. Now we have the key position type with black to move, no, white to move, sorry. Black to move, and it's a draw. We can use this idea. Black is drawing. So that doesn't work. So here we need to use the magic trick to win a couple of tempi. So how do we do it? Yeah, checking from the side doesn't really help us here. So we would like to get behind the pawn as the ideal thing, but actually we are in time to be in front of the pawn here. So let's see, no matter what black does here, we're going to go in front of the pawn. And now we have transferred our rook to g2, and we have forced the king back one square. So we won 2 tempos here. And now we can bring our king in, and we see that white is in time here to check the king away because there's no king f3. Black has to play g4, and now we can simply make sure that our king will enter. And this is easily winning for white. I guess this is the easiest. Okay, so that was an example of the magical trick in action. So it can work in front of the pawn and behind the pawn. It depends on how far advanced the pawn is. Okay, let's take another example. So this is a key position if the king is coming from behind. And some of you might have seen a Reti study, famous Reti study. It is based on this idea of there's a position of mutual tuktuan. So what is the winning move for white here? Let's see, if you play king b6, then you're trying to get around and get in with the king. Then I will choose this side too to keep your king out while I move forward with my king. And then there is no good way to really get the white king in. Let's say I can start pushing the pawn and keeping your king out. And I'm about to move the king to c2. So this is drawing for black. So we need to find a better way to get the white king in. The move here is king d7. And this is a position of mutual tuktuan. The famous Reti study I was referring to is that white has a rook here on d2. And I believe he plays the rook down to d1, giving this position of neutral tuktuan. So the problem for black is that if he goes one way, then white goes the other way. So now we can go this way. And we are attacking the pawn, so there's no time for king e2, and white is winning. And the same if black goes the other way. So why is it a position of mutual tuktuan? So let's imagine white is to move. Let me give an extra move to white. So white doesn't really have any good waiting move. So we need the rook in front of the pawn so it doesn't move forward. But if we play something like rook d2, then black will win a crucial tempo when he plays king e3. If we try to make waiting moves or moves with the king, then black can just follow like this. So every time you, let's say you make a move with the rook, you're going to disturb your setup and lose a tempo for later. So this is just drawing. The king should have been there. So this is winning. This is drawing for black. Okay. Yeah. Let's see. Okay, so we can go a little bit into, let's say, opening theory, or sorry, endgame theory. So let's see, black to move and draw. So the way black should draw this is probably to forget all about this pawn and then focus on how to fight a central pawn like the one on e5. So what would you play here with black? So white's promotion square is here and black's promotion square is on b1. So this is not so easy. So instead of starting with, we can get, yeah, you could say it's a Filio gone bad. So let's try to go to some, let's see. Let me try another position first. Let's see. Okay, if you're black here, what would you play? I think most of you know this. Yeah, we have Rook B6. Just give black the move. Okay, so this the 6th rank defense. And white cannot really improve his position. And when white moves this pawn forward, we go all the way down. And then there's no, white was threatening king g6 and some checkmate threats, but now the white king has nowhere to hide and we have a draw. That's the Philidor position, yeah. So let's say if white is to move, white can play king g6 with the idea that he's keeping the option open of both king f6 and f6. And here we play rook b1. And this is winning for white because now we have, if black should defend this, the black king should be on the short side. So the short side is over here. And then we have the rook on the long side, giving a lot of checks from the distance. So now white is winning by building a bridge. The key moment here was that white was able to break the 6th rank by giving a check on f6. So that's really the key difference. So king g6 on move 1 is winning for white. So let's say it's black to move. And black by mistake, let's say, plays rook to b1 instead of doing the Filidor, and white plays king g6 here. How would you defend this position now with black? So you could say this is a Filidor gone bad, yeah. But sometimes we don't have the luxury of, you know, taking up the 6th rank. So we also need this second defense. It's called the casted defense. Yeah, so if Rook B5, I believe that now Black has a problem. Because we can check and then we can break with this check on F6. That's the difference. So check, check, the king is on the short side, our pawn will get down. So this is winning. So it's all about breaking on F6. Let's see. So let's see, we go all the way back and king G6. Yeah, we can play Rook G1. And now we have to choose a side and we choose the short side. So, okay, I play Rook F8 now so that I can move the king and push the pawn. And now we go to the long side. Yeah. So that's the way of defending. Let's see. Let me see. Check. Can I just see that again? Check here. Yeah. So this is a way of defending. So this worked for Black. I think the casted defense is even easier. Just focusing on, let's say, breaking on F6. So we can simply play Rook F1 here. Okay, so if Rook check, then although we are on the long side with the king, which we shouldn't be, we control this square, so there's no check. And then we can just go back. So if the king goes here, we should go to the short side. Again, if Rook F8, we have Rook A1, we go to the long side. And what do we do if White play King E6? So that's the whole idea of putting the rook here behind the pawn. We play King G7, yes. So that's the casted defense, just taking up this square. If White checks, we go in front of the pawn again, and now we can start all over. It's like a merry-go-round. Black is absolutely fine. So it's quite safe to have the rook here behind the pawn. Okay, let me unshare for a moment. Let's get back to that other position. So that was from a real game. And now that we know the casted defense, it's Rook E1 is just an easy way of drawing. We don't have to concern ourselves with that B5 pawn. We can just make waiting moves here. And if White plays here, we go to the short side. And now we're just ready to stop the pawn from ever moving forward. Well, there is still some work to do, let's say, when we go to the long side. White can still try a lot of tricks, especially when the pawn on 6th rank. But theoretically, it's a draw. So let's see what he did in the game. He played Rook H1. And now White broke with E6. So he tried to find salvation in that other idea we have in the position, namely the rook versus pawn race. So the casted defense is obviously to give away the pawn and go for the defense. But he's trying the active defense, giving up the rook and trying to draw like this. Yeah, so White is winning this. Let's see if Black tries to be clever and play King D4. Let's say I'm moving my king forward and I'm body checking the White king. So what do we do now? Now we can use half the magic trick. We can force the king back to c4, which helps us getting our own king in. So rook b8. And now we can get the king in. And if we watch a couple of moves more, you will see that we have the key position type with white to move. And white is winning. So there is, this is winning for white, no problems. Let's see something like this. Yeah. So there is one idea. You should know that with a b pawn, there are some stalemate tricks, but they only work if the rook is on the second rank. Here we can just make a waiting move, something like that. So white is just winning. But if the rook was on the second rank, black can use this stalemate defense. But here white is just winning with the rook behind the pawn. So that is winning. So king d4 was kind of clever, but rook b8 wins the crucial tempo. And b4, we bring our king in. And we see, again, we get to the key position type with white to move. White is winning. If black was to move here, then king c2, king d1 is our normal way of drawing these positions. Okay. Let's take another example. Okay, so Rook Endgames are very complicated. This complicated example I want to wait a little bit with. Let's see, let me just get back on track with the other examples. Yeah, let me show you this example from Auerbach. It's just one example of Auerbach going wrong, and not because he's a bad author or anything, just because these Rook Endgames are so full of tricks. So not out of disrespect, but every time I read a book on Rook Endgames, I always consult the engine on the side. So especially for old books, simply because these mistakes, they do happen all the time. So we need some checkup. Auerbach believes that, okay, king e6, white is trying to get to this pawn. And then after that, win the game. So how should black defend? Well, he can check and then try to bring the king in. So the exclamation mark is Auerbach's. So I think king d8 was played in the game. And then white was able to play rook e6. And now we're cutting off the black king without having to worry about this sacrifice because the rook is hanging. So that's exactly the idea of king d7. Let's say if white tries to cut off the king now, then we have rook takes f4. So because of this king d7, Auerbach thought that black was drawing. Well, the king is getting in front of the pawn, and we have our drawing setup. So let's see, rook a4. Yeah, so for instance, if rook a5 check, and then there's no chance we're getting in front of the pawn now. White can simply check us away. So it's about getting in front of that pawn. So attacking that pawn from the side here makes it a little bit hard for white to move forward. And now rook f6, king goes to e7, king g6, and now rook a1. And Auerbach thought this was a draw based on, let's say, rook f5, rook g5, and then just attacking that pawn. And now we can get to f8. That is one line. So rook g5 doesn't really work because of rook f1. The other line he looked at was king g7. And now check, rook behind that pawn. And now the king has to stay there. And black can simply wait now with king e8 because white cannot free himself unless he moves the king up, and then we can get in front of pawn again. So what Auerbach had missed was a intermediate move, not surprisingly. So it turns out that this king is too perfect here because it's ready to go to f8, and so we just start by playing rook f7 check. The problem is that let's see. Then after the check, we have the f6 square. So that's the problem with moving king e8. If black plays king e6, then we have f5 with a check. That's the problem with e6. So those two square had a problem. e7 was perfect, so that's why our intermediate check on f7 worked. And now it's obvious to see that we can check the king out. And there's no chance we're going to build a bridge and win this Rook Endgame. We can see that real quickly. Something like this. So let's say we get to a position like this. So what's the normal way of building a bridge? Just a little bit of repetition here doesn't harm us. How does white win this? Yeah, rook e4. First the 4th rank and then the 5th rank. And the reason, if we go to the 5th rank immediately, then black can annoy us with king there. So we go to the 4th rank first. And then we can go out with the king. And if I keep checking, oh, sorry. Before we go to the 4th rank, we have to check the black king away. And now the king has to go. That's quite important when we exchange rooks later, that the king is not close to the pawn. King e6 doesn't work because we have this check here that wins the rook. So the king is forced out here. And now we go to the 4th rank. Could also go rook e4 and then give a check later. That's okay. But we get to the 4th rank now, and now we can bring our king out. And if I keep checking, we have the rook on the 4th rank that can go between. And if I just make a waiting move, because white doesn't really support the pawn now, this is where we go from the 4th rank to the 5th rank, and there's nothing stopping rook f5. Okay, let's take one more example. Yeah, so here's an example of, now it's getting complicated because the rook is behind the pawn. So white can get into some kind of Zugzwang because there's no waiting moves with this rook. So if white thinks that he can just go for a race, rook versus pawn, and draw the game like this, he would, well, if black just plays king g2, then we can probably just take here already now, and then c5. This looks like a draw for white quite easily. So, but black is more clever. Black plays king e4. And now we have to be careful, because if we play c5 now, there is a check here. And let's say something like this. black can check and then pick up this pawn and then just go all the way back. So this is winning for black. So black can use this strategy because the white rook cannot move. So in order to draw the game, white has to give up this pawn and then try to fight against this pawn as quickly as possible. So we have to go towards g6 and then try to get up the ball. That's our only chance. So this is how it goes. Okay, what do we do now with white? So it's one of those instances where you have to choose the right square. And in my book, Sharp Endgames, I have these 16 parameters where I measure the performance when you play this position against an engine or another player. And one of them is king movements. And so because there are different ways to get across the board. So we can, if we want to get to this pawn, we can go this way and this way. So sometimes we have to step carefully depending on what our goal is. Here the goal is to try to keep the black king out. So we have to play king f4. So these are the details, and it happens quite a lot in these endgames. We have to move the king correctly across the board. And we're not done yet because black has rook g8 check. Let me just show you why king g4 loses. Yeah, black is simply getting in here. And in this position, we are forced to take the pawn. And that simply loses because of king f2. So we have to go king f4 to keep the black king out and then get to g3. But black still has tricks here, rook g8. What do we do here? Where should the king go now? We can go to h3, we can take the pawn, we can go back to f4. So let's see, this loses again to king f2. King h3 isn't much better because I can play king f2 still. If you take with the rook here, I have king f3, and you're going to get mated or lose the rook. So the only move here is king f4. And after rook g2, we still need to be precise. So the only drawing move here is to move the rook out. And it turns out there is no way for black to really improve the position. If rook g1, we have a check on the second rank that picks up the pawn. And black can't really do anything to improve its position here, so that's a draw. King g4 is a mistake because black can try to get back behind the pawn. So let's say. And guess what? Before we go back to g8, let's just disturb the white king a little bit with an intermediate check. And now we get behind and now we get back because now we have king f2 and black is winning. So that rook g4 with another intermediate check. Okay. Yeah, that's all I wanted to show in this masterclass.